Hi, I'm Brian Kelly. I'm the editor and chief content officer of U.S. News and World Report, and I'm here to talk today about STEM education and jobs. Before we begin, I wanted to make a public service announcement. If you're having trouble hearing the presentation, just click Hide Video and Show Video up at the top of your screen to refresh it. And please send your questions in, and we will talk a little bit about some of the issues and then get to some of the answers of the questions that you have as well. If you're listening to this, you probably have an idea of what STEM is. But I think maybe we can talk in a little more detail. It may be a little broader and more complicated perhaps than people ordinarily think of it. So I want to talk a little bit about what is STEM, why it matters, how you can get the background that you need to move forward in it, and where to go. Ultimately, the question everybody wants to know, where to go for the best STEM education. And I think also very important, keeping in mind that like any education, the outcome is not necessarily just a degree, it's a job. So looking ahead down the road, what are the STEM jobs? What are you going to need to get there? I think you really have to start thinking of this as a career pathway, and understanding where you're trying to get in the career you will help you fit in the pieces of the education. So when we talk about STEM, obviously there's the thing that people immediately think of as scientists in white coats and people doing intense research, literal rocket scientists, people doing building bridges perhaps. But STEM is in many ways, the way we look at it, U.S. News, it is a very large slice of the future. It's very much about the technology economy, how that's changing, how many careers actually require either an intense STEM discipline, but in many, many cases, some STEM. And I think that's really one of the things to keep in mind. I mean, yes, if you want to be a doctor, that's a STEM field, and the path is pretty well made for you there in terms of the qualifications that you're going to need. If you want to be a physicist and design rockets and go work for NASA, that's understood. But it's important for people to understand that STEM involves things like manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs, which are changing rapidly, not the old dirty factory floor jobs that really many people associate with it. That world has changed enormously. You know, people make things now with robots, and you can't run a robot unless you have the kind of background that involves some of the STEM skills, some of the science, technology, engineering, mathematics. They interact in some ways. In some cases, they're separate. You could be just an engineer. You could be just in the technology space, perhaps computers. Science obviously encompasses things like biology, as well as chemistry, physics, that whole range of subjects. But I think one of the keys to keep in mind is that STEM going forward is in everything. We see it in so many different professions now, and the need for some of that background is really critical. Critical, I say, at the beginning because of the jobs question. When we come at U.S. News, we cover education in great detail. We rank colleges. We have lots of information on our website, usnews.com, about individual schools, about programs that might suit your needs, whether it's engineering or some of these other specific disciplines, majors that we're talking about. But we also have a lot of jobs coverage. In fact, that's our largest growth area, is our employment area, where we look at best careers and we look at best options for jobs for you and break down the subject. What's the job? What does it pay? What do you need to get that job? One of the things that we realized really in the last few years with so many of those jobs were either directly technology jobs. I mean, if you look at the top careers that we have, probably 8 out of the top 15 easily are technology, computer engineer, software engineer. Some of them, even as a computer coder, more of a basic entry position to the computer field, but essential, and companies, unable to fill the needs that they have for those jobs. Data analysts. We have the emerging world of big data. All the information that's being collected on the internet in so many forms these days is a tremendously valuable resource, but who knows what to do with it? Who are the analysts who understand how to weed through all this information and make it useful for a business, for a hospital, for so many different functions in the world. So when you start to look at those job openings, and in fact the number of those jobs that are open, if you take a step back and look at the American economy today, everybody's very concerned about jobs and the unemployment rate. But today there are more than 3 million unfilled jobs, 3 million jobs that are posted by companies looking for workers to fill various needs that they can't fill. And we interview those companies. We talk to them quite a bit in various forms of our reporting and information. And the theme that keeps coming back to us is we can't find the people with the skills, in many cases the technical skills, to do the work. People don't have the fundamental math background sometimes. They don't have a higher level of the scientific skills, whether it's basic computing needs. And this I think is something that people have to keep very much front and center as they think about their careers, as they think about what the opportunities that will be presented for them will be. When you start on the STEM field, and people say, what is this really? And I always say, it's the hard stuff. The STEM subjects are the ones that are tough, and in many cases, we've all had that experience of going into a classroom or picking a college course and saying, gee, I hope there's no math in this, or I hope there's not too much math. The fact of the matter is that there almost always is going to be math or some version of it. And as much as it can be difficult and painful, this is the sort of things that you really do need to learn and really make sure that you have that background. I interviewed a very prominent prize-winning scientist once for U.S. News, and we were talking about this subject, and she was teaching at a college level, and she said, I get lots of different kinds of students who have shortcomings in their background coming into chemistry and physics and some of these higher subjects, and she said, but if they have the math background, I can fix them. I can turn them into scientists if they have the desire, the intelligence, and the math background. If they're missing the math, and this is a problem that goes back, anybody who's followed this goes back to elementary school, and if you don't have the right algebra, you can't move to algebra 2, and you can't move to pre-calc. So you really have to make sure that if you have holes in that math background, that you filled it. But it's also, I think, people say, well, it's so daunting, I can't do the math, or I can't do enough of the math, that I really shouldn't pursue this field. And I think that's against there are broader opportunities than might be apparent. I mean, if you go into engineering, for instance, and you want to build bridges, there is a pretty rigorous program that you're going to have to follow. And I look at it and say, gee, I hope so, because I don't want the bridges to fall down. But everybody who goes into civil engineering, for instance, or mechanical engineering, is not necessarily building bridges or want to build bridges. They may start in that curriculum and find that there are multiple applications that are perhaps not quite as rigorous. But more and more universities are aware of that and are creating multiple paths for engineering. So you have applied engineering. You have various fields where people will take a path that doesn't lead them to the 5-year master's degree or PhD. That's something that I think is very important in a lot of schools, is to look at the flexibility, the variability that they give you in these programs. When you get into these programs, and again, we get a lot of this feedback from some of the people that we talk to, there are some significant challenges, and in some cases they involve, as I'm saying, the rigor of these programs, where schools are intent on actually flushing people out. The classic, engineering science professor says, first day of class, look at the person on your left, look at the person on your right. One of you is not going to be here by the end of the semester. That's a pretty scary way to start a college experience. But there's an increasing awareness, I think, in many universities, not all, that there has to be a better way to teach some of these subjects, and there's a lot of thinking in the academic world of how do they revise the way that they're presenting this. Women have a particular problem. It's a big national issue that women who start in the STEM fields in college flush out at a high rate. As many as 2/3 of the folks who start in STEM disciplines do not finish them. Which again is not to say that they don't move into other areas STEM related that could be very useful. and helpful for their careers. But it is an issue, and in many cases there's suggestions of science, engineering, etc., being very male-dominated, being unfriendly to women. Something to be aware of, and the more progressive schools are aware of this and are doing some things to combat it. But definitely, when you're thinking in terms of career advice, this is something you really want to keep in mind. When we talk about where to go, we're not the ones who are here to tell you exactly the place to go. We have a lot of data, I think, that can be very helpful on that. If you go to usnews.com, we have a tremendous number of searchable data points for 1,500 colleges and universities. So we look at all the four-year accredited schools. Also, as an aside, I think very important to keep in mind the two-year schools. Many of the STEM fields are very well represented in two-year community colleges, and for many people that is a better path for them, either on the way to a four-year degree or on the way to a job. Interesting story was the head of a very large aircraft manufacturing company told me one day. He said, it's not that hard for me to find the engineers to design the airplanes. He said, we go to MIT and Caltech and we get some of the best talent out there. They want to we're a great company. They want to design planes for us and we pay a lot of money. He said, the biggest problem I have is finding people to put the wings on the airplanes. He said, we use titanium and sophisticated high-tech materials that require computer design. They require robotics to assemble them, and these are what used to be thought of as shop floor workers. These are $75,000, $100,000 a year jobs. The skills can be learned in a two-year program with various STEM-related fields, and again, some of the basic math background and some of the other things, and then manufacturing certificates, which is in some ways becoming a very nice complement to college degrees. The whole certification programs, which allow you to take courses that have been approved by manufacturing associations, people like the National Association of Manufacturers, for instance, that will say this gives you a certification to work with high-tech metal or some of these various kinds of components. So there's a lot of value in exploring the full range of the universe. One of the things that's also important in terms of thinking about STEM that comes up is the balance. We hear from employers that they actually can get some pretty good technical minds, but these are people who lack in communication skills. These are people who lack in fundamental writing ability or the ability to work in teams. You think of these sort of things you may take for granted, but these are very important skills that, ideally in a four-year college curriculum, you have the opportunity to be exposed to improve some of your abilities in those ways. Not necessarily a given, not taken for granted, and especially if you go into the very intense, rigorous scientific fields, often those things are left off the table. It becomes the classic geek, the classic nerd, buried in the library or the laboratory, buried in front of a computer screen, and not really paying attention enough to the outside world. The message that we get from the employer side is the outside world components are very important. Take the time to take some other courses that are not directly STEM related, but that allow you to expand your basic abilities to work in a work environment. The opposite side of that coin, excuse me, is for people who aren't STEM majors or aren't necessarily thinking of going deeply into a STEM discipline. The advice that we get, again, from a lot of employers is you should take some STEM. I mean, anybody who's a liberal arts graduate should have I think, and from the evidence I see, a significant grounding in those STEM subjects, math, some basic science, certainly computing, statistics, those areas. And if you look at the workforce and look at the future and ask yourself a simple question, is the world going to become less technological by the time you graduate in 4 years? I think you have to conclude no. And where is it going to be in 8 years and 10 years and 20 years on? So having those basic building blocks, you may decide that you're going into business. But what are the businesses going to be? Well, they're going to be technology businesses, or they're going to be medical informatics, or they're going to be things that use big data. So having that fundamental background to be able to talk to the scientists or talk to the folks that you work with that maybe are deeper down the technological funnel is going to be invaluable. And the other, I think the other important point to make is this idea of flexibility. And this is again great fundamental advice that anybody gets when they're starting on a college career. You think you know what you're going to do, but you may change your mind 4 times by the time you graduate. So keeping your options open, I think is, even within the STEM disciplines, I think is something that's really important, and has a lot to do with the school that you ultimately pick. Do they offer, an array of opportunities? If you go into engineering in an intense way and want to move into a more applied, how hard is that to do? How hard is it to move out of a more traditional curriculum? So I think those are some of the important questions that you have to be asking. We want to take some questions from a number of folks out there and respond to some of the things that are on your mind. And please, if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to send them along. So one of the questions that came over is is my favorite subject, math. And the person asks, I'm not great at math. Does that rule out STEM careers or education as an option for me? And the simple answer is no, not necessarily. It depends. There are a number of STEM disciplines that don't require an intense amount of math. Some of the computer fields, the computer coding, pre-calc is probably more than you need. So algebra 2 or sometimes even high school level applied math definitely works. If you're defining STEM more broadly into the life sciences, some biology, for instance, moving into the medical fields, there may be less of a demand for that. Although I think you can't ignore it. Certainly, the educators I talk to really stress that point. I mean, math obviously is a big problem in America. We don't get enough of it. We're not learning enough. We're not being pushed to take those curriculums. And as I said at the beginning, it's the hard part. But there's a lot of research and evidence which says most people are not math deficient in that they're never going to be able to learn this. You can learn it. You have to put in the time. Math really is a function of, first and foremost, is what the teachers call seat time. You've got to figure out how to get yourself in front of a textbook, or increasingly interestingly, a computer screen. Math is a subject that we see a lot of evidence. It can be learned well in a technological environment. It lends itself to the online curriculum for, perhaps for remediation or perhaps for practice. Maybe folks are familiar with the Khan Academy. Sal Khan is a visionary who has really pioneered the ability of teaching math on videos, on demand. So you do the video until you get the problem right. So I think the advice there is, yes, you can squeak by with a minimal amount of math in some aspects of STEM, but why would you really want to? I think you really want to buckle down and do what it takes to get yourself up to the starting line for college level work in the mathematical fields. So the question comes, says, don't STEM careers involve sitting at a computer churning out code? And again, the answer is some do. Some code is an interesting, evolving field in some ways. That if you think of computing, how much demand there is for people who can code the back end of computer programs, companies are falling all over themselves to find enough people to do this. I visited a company in Texas a little while ago that had such high demand for coders and such little supply from the regional education system that they've started their own academy to train coders. Now, for some people, this is a first step to a career. They say coding is the alphabet of computing, the alphabet of the new technology, and is obviously could be a very valuable skill as a starting point. But for other folks, maybe coding is is a great career option. There are code academies that are starting now specifically to introduce high school level kids to this. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I wouldn't, if sitting in front of a computer doing code is not your vision of the future and what's going to work for you, totally understand that, but it also could be a very attractive path. There are other options. Let's see, we've got a question. My son is a freshman at Northwestern University doing pre-med. The problem is that his GPA is not so high, 3.44, and he is concerned that he will not be able to get into the top medical schools. What option does he have in STEM fields if he could not go to the medical school of his choice? In other words, what are the jobs related to the medical field, if not a doctor? Well, I would first refer you to usnews.com jobs, where there are many jobs there. But if you look at medicine and the technological advances that are being made, it's an exciting, very rich field to be in. So much of medicine, in many respects going forward, I think will not be directly related to doctors. You will certainly need some advanced training, master's degrees and PhDs, but medical informatics, genetics, all of the nanotechnology, pharmaceuticals, there are multiple areas where someone with a good, solid science background, perhaps not able to clear the bar, the very high bar still that exists in medical schools, will have so many different options. Even the clinical options, the nursing profession is greatly expanded. You have nurses who are now serving in hospital settings, almost the equivalent of what we used to think of as doctors. A lot of questions about the medical profession itself as we go forward. How many physicians will we be able to turn out, and will we have the physicians that we need? But the answer may be we don't need as many as we used to have. Surgery is performed by robots. Minor surgery at some point may not be performed by an actual physician. It may be performed by more of a medical technician. So I would have, there's a lot of good options out there. It's certainly the feedback that I get. I have another question coming in. In a previous chat, someone asked why STEM scholarships are so limited, even though they are so high in demand. Would you know anything about this? I don't know specifically. I guess I would probably need to know more about the particular fields that you're talking about. I think there are some overserved fields. There are aspects. There's certain kinds of engineers. When you listen to the anecdotal evidence, it can be deceptive, I think, sometimes, where you'll see a story that says, the U.S. has too many engineers. And that's the headline. But when you read into it, it's, well, what kind of engineers? We may have an oversupply of them. At any given time, there's sometimes an oversupply of a certain kind of talent. But across the board, there's all the evidence that I've seen is that there is an undersupply of the STEM-related fields. And we may have too many rocket scientists at a given moment because NASA's not setting up as many rockets, but that's a tiny contingent of people. On the scholarship level, we certainly see, and we have reported on, a tremendous increase in the awareness and the interest and the importance of focusing on STEM. The companies are in many ways driving this. I think we try to frame STEM as a jobs issue because we think that's the most productive way to help to put it in front of people. We spend a lot of time talking to employers and engaging employers. What is it that you're looking for? How they make that connection with the universities is a key piece. It's not great right now in many cases. I think there's a big disconnect between what the universities are teaching and what the employers want. We're very much engaged in being in the middle of that dialogue. We run a big conference on STEM every year that brings together employers and educators. We do a lot of content on our website about this. And obviously with our consumer content, we're trying to connect people to jobs and to education. The specific scholarship question is a good one. I'll have to look into it. But it may just be the institution you're looking at, because I see a lot of, if you're a smart kid in a scientific discipline, these schools are increasingly hungry to have you. Let me see, another question here comes in. Yeah. Whoops. Here's a good, okay. What major is preferably good for MCAT entrance? Oh boy. Well, having not gone to medical school, my sense of it is that it's a pretty rigorous program that most pre-med programs lay out. And you know that people have to take organic chemistry, and which is always the killer. That's another one of those courses where they say, look to the left, look to the right. One or two of you is not going to be here when the semester is over. The biological sciences are very good. I certainly have known a number of people who majored in mathematics. It's again, it's the tough stuff. You have to take the tough stuff because it's gonna come up for those exams. And I think a better expert than me, of course, would be the dean of the program that you're involved in. But I don't think there's a huge variation. I mean, certainly we've seen a lot of examples of people who have gone through a more traditional undergraduate curriculum, done well, didn't really think that they were interested in medical school till later, and then did postgraduate study to pick up those essentials, organic chemistry and the various biological sciences that you do have to have for that. So I would definitely consult with the experts on that. So as a follow-up question, do you think there's too many doctors already? We're going to probably get a little far afield. Again, everything I look at, all the statistical evidence, the demographic trends, would suggest quite the opposite. We are going to be in need of many more doctors than we have right now, and it's going to be a real challenge for the medical profession to figure out where we get them. Whether we increase the number of foreign doctors that we're bringing in, whether we do somehow modify the basic job description and allow more allied health professionals to come into that space. The increasing use of technology to enhance and extend a doctor's ability to do diagnoses and things. These are all things that are coming down the pike, but it's really inconceivable for me to think about somebody starting as a medical professional and not essentially finding plenty of opportunities for work. How much that work is going to pay, as we know from following the whole medical policy discussion related to Obamacare, is an open question. I mean, the salaries of doctors may decline, and not as a result necessarily of the market forces. There's plenty of demand, but because medicine is in a sense becoming a regulated industry, and the government will be, is already imposing price controls on it. So when you do that, you do distort the labor marketplace. So there's some questions to ask there. Most of the people that I know that are doctors did it because they have a passion for medicine, a passion for the profession, and they didn't do it to become rich. Unfortunately, going forward, it may be that you absolutely aren't going to become rich. And then that raises a whole other question, what you're paying for medical school, because it is extraordinarily expensive. So if you're not going to make enough money to make back what it costs you to pay your tuition, where does that leave you? And then I think that's going to get us into a further discussion of who pays for medical school. And in many cases, probably shouldn't be the student. So, but that's something that we don't have the full answers on. We have to keep looking at that. The question here comes: do STEM majors earn more money than non-STEM majors? And the simple answer is yes, they do. All of the highest paying jobs, of the 20 highest paying jobs, I think about 16 of them are related to STEM. Some of these professions I mentioned before, computer software engineer, the top of the list, medical informatics, masters in medical informatics. Some of there is a very clearly defined difference between college graduates who majored in STEM fields and college graduates who majored in and traditional liberal arts. Significant income difference there. Question, if I go into STEM, does that mean that I have to be a scientist? It's a great question, depending on what you define as a scientist. And I think we did talk about that a little bit at the beginning. No, you do not have to be a scientist in any way. Certainly not a, if you fear the lab-coated guy working with rats or, pouring chemicals in beakers, that is a relatively, I would say, in terms of numbers, a relatively small part of what we see in the STEM professions. The STEM experience, the STEM education, the background can lead into so many different paths, and one of them we see is business. I was at a conference with. We're talking about STEM employment, and some of the big accounting firms were there, and the big consulting firms that do very high-level, sophisticated work. Much of it related to numbers, and one of the engineering groups was complaining because they said, you're stealing away all of our talent. All the best math students are not going into the engineering fields, they're going to the business fields because, Wall Street, for instance, I mean, many of the most accomplished traders, the hedge fund firms that have these, they trade stocks and other financial products based on very sophisticated mathematical models. So there are extraordinary opportunities that are outside the pure science areas. Okay, the number of kids applying to college has increased dramatically, or so say the admissions staff at the colleges my son applied to. It's discouraging to the kids who are B or B+ students since they are waitlisted at top schools. I'm referring to my son who wants to study industrial engineering. The good news is that he was accepted to an engineering college but did not get into his first or even second choice. My point is that this has discouraged kids in even wanting to major in science, technology, engineering, or math. By the way, I'm a woman engineer working for the largest defense contractor in the USA. I encourage all young women to major in STEM. Well, it's a competitive landscape. I mean, there's no question about it. Being in the college, having the role in the college admissions business, and I have to be a little clinical and say, I'm sorry you didn't get into your first or second choice, but your third choice was probably a good one. There's a lot of good schools out there. I think, as there is an increasing public awareness of the importance of STEM, we are seeing, and we're going to continue to see, more kids wanting to go into those fields, and it naturally has to make it more competitive. There's no doubt about that. But I would not see this as something that should discourage people. It's indicative that they're, going into the generally right area. You have to take a clear-eyed assessment of your own skills and your own career path. The third best school could be equally terrific. We're the guys who rank these schools, so we know that the difference between a very top school and one slightly below is not necessarily enormous. And then obviously it does relate to what exactly you want to do, and is that the right program for that, and how's that school going to help you get a job. Your second point about women is a huge one. We've done quite a bit of work on that in terms of reporting on it and finding tools. There's a significant shortage in many fields of women who are capable of doing computing, engineering, etc. Schools are very eager, I think, to be able to bring young female students in the STEM disciplines, and then consequently companies are very interested in being able to hire them. So I think your encouragement is well taken. What sorts of after-school programs and competitions are there for people interested in STEM? And it's a really good question. Again, if you're on the cusp, you're looking at college, it's great to have a lot of other things besides just your classroom experience. And we're seeing a real explosion, I think, in a very good way, in these kind of programs that challenge kids to do more things, more hands-on things with STEM. So things like the first robotics competition, which many people are familiar with, where teams at schools, sometimes multiple teams at the same school, build functioning robots, things that drive around and do something. Last year they had a big national competition, and the challenge was to shoot a basketball into a hoop. So you had these kids driving these really remarkable machines around, competing with each other, trying to get around the opponent and line up the optics and have the mechanical lever to shoot the basketball. It's a competition like the NCAA basketball tournament. They have regionals, and you move on to the next step, and there's a final four. They have cheerleaders. It's just really exciting. I've been to a number of these, and a lot of these kinds of competitions are springing up. There's some race car competitions that they're working on, a variety of other related robotics. You look at groups like the 4-H Club, the Girl Scouts. They have all intensely gotten into these fields where they're trying to create the hands-on experience. Hands-on is really critical to science education, and the after-school piece of it is crucial. There's only so much. I mean, there are deep questions about what's being taught in the high school level in many high schools. That's sort of a separate story. We do have some real shortcomings in the ability of teachers to teach math and science well, or at having enough teachers that teach it well. There are too many high schools that don't do it well. And for some kids, these after-school programs are the only alternative. The other piece of it, too, that I would encourage anybody to look for is internships or mentoring programs, things that involve actual corporations. Many of the corporations that hire scientists that are very deeply involved in this are eager to have their scientists out there working with kids, mentoring them, bringing them into the work environment so they can see in a real world way what's it like to manufacture something, what's it like to to create Linux computer coding. So these are the problem here with science. It's, for so many kids, it's an abstraction. They don't really get it. But when they see it, when they see what it means, it takes on a whole new dimension. And these after-school programs are really terrific. We do have some opportunity to, some resources, I think, on the website that might be helpful in finding some of these things. So questions, do you think it's a good path for my son to switch to business or choose a medical-related field if he could not get into medical school? Thanks a lot. He has to make the call pretty soon. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of people in business that I come across with a medical background. I know a lot of former practicing physicians who are now in some of these medical-related fields, who are working for startup technology companies, because I don't want to make any prejudgment about the satisfaction people get from a given field. Some doctors could not be happier doing what they're doing from start to finish. But like any profession, you may get to a point where you've done all you're going to do. How many, as one guy said, I performed all the heart surgeries I was going to perform, and decided to get out of it. It's a stressful field. I think he had felt he had done what he wanted to do in terms of the social aspect of it, the giving back, and he said, it's time for me to try something else. So, the good news is the skill sets that he had, skill sets that somebody has going deep into a medical education program, are so significant. They're so valuable and in so many ways translatable. So sure, boy, if I had a good medical background, that's the first place I'd be looking these days is in business, because I think there's going to be some extraordinary things that are going to happen there that are going to be both good business and good for society. I mean, you're still talking, you're talking about finding the cure for diseases. And as we say, it may not be a doctor that's going to find that. Maybe somebody with a good medical background who knows how to run a supercomputer. So I think that cross-pollination is going to be a very, very important thing going forward. A couple more questions. We're winding down here. Let me check the question comes in, you do have to go to a 4-year college to pursue a STEM career. And I hinted at that earlier, and the answer is no. Community colleges are a very valuable part of the STEM pathway. And not all community colleges are created equal, but there are some really good programs. There's some really good community colleges. And in many cases, what's happening is you're seeing a connection, much more so at community colleges than with the four-year schools. You're seeing a connection between the employers, regional employers, and community colleges, where the employers are going to the college and they're saying, we need 4,000 people to work in our manufacturing shop, or wherever the part of the country. In the Southwest, in Texas, they're dying for workers in the energy industry. The fracking, the new oil discoveries there, these are highly technological jobs. This is not just sticking a big pipe into the ground and capturing the oil as it comes out. These are very sophisticated. They're finding oil and energy sources all over the place that we never thought were going to be there. There's billions of dollars being invested and tens of thousands of jobs. There's 400,000 people in Texas right now working in the oil energy industry, and they expect that may double in the next, probably not double, but it will increase significantly in the next 10, 20 years. So community college, where you're learning, you've got to get the math back up, the basic math. Many of these schools are teaching it remedially, but if that's what that's where you go. And then these more sophisticated programs that are very tailored to the workplace. It's not the vocational education of the old days. I think many people feel like vocational education became a stigma, and it's like, that wasn't for me. I'm too smart for that. I'm going to go, get a 4-year degree. But again, if you talk about salaries, a 2-year degree, an associate's degree in a STEM field, will pay you a higher salary than a 4-year degree in a traditional liberal arts field. Those are discouraging numbers, I think, for some of the people who are in the traditional liberal arts field. But very encouraging, I think. And of course, if you have a 2-year degree, doesn't preclude that you can't go back and get the 4-year degree. We see that increasingly too. I think we're down to our last couple of questions here. Well, what classes should I be taking now in high school to prepare for a STEM major in college? I think we covered that. Excuse me. I think we've covered that to some degree, but again, it's probably the courses that you think are hard. You really, I think, what we've seen, the evidence, you really need to be ideally up to a pre-calculus level, which means you need to have, mastered algebra by freshman year. You need to have taken algebra 2. You know that routine. Most of these schools on the more sophisticated programs are going to want 4 years of a hard science. They're going to want chemistry and bio and physics. Having some more of those, I think having a statistics background, I think, is extremely helpful. Having some computer background can also be extremely helpful. So that's the evidence that we get, and I think it's the other thing it's important for parents, and if parents with younger children, is how important it is to get on the pathway for these subjects in elementary school. If you don't learn fractions, the experts tell us, by 4th grade, if you haven't mastered fractions by 4th grade, you got a problem. You're gonna have gaps, because everything about math is cumulative. So, a lot of kids should be exposed to more numbers in preschool, in kindergarten. So I think, as a parent, is your kid can he take algebra in 8th grade? Ideally, I guess, or certainly by 9th grade. And if he's not taking algebra by 9th grade, I think you really have to ask a serious question: why not? Is he or she so incapable of dealing with math? And there are some people like that, no question. Or is it just, does the school not push it? Are we being too lazy? That's a real rubber meets the road question here, and it just builds on from there. And I've had experience. I remember talking once to an educator who was practically in tears, and it was an inner city program, and he said, half the kids in this school have no reasonable math background, and they, when they get out of the real world, they're finished. I mean, their career options are so limited. And he said it's just a tragedy. So there's some real serious questions that I think that descend down into a much lower level. But hopefully everybody's getting a little better sense of awareness and paying more attention to these things. I think we'll just check and see if there's any more. I think that probably covers it for us. we've touched on I think most of the parts of STEM. I appreciate the interest that people have. If there's other questions that we can answer at US News, please keep us in mind. We have usnews.com is full of information for college students, for people looking for jobs, and for people just wanting to follow this issue, which we think is a really critical one and one that we're going to keep on. So thanks very much for joining us today.